I want to thank everyone for taking the time to, on this beautiful day, at least here in the South, to listen to some amazing minds tell us about what is going on with immigration, global migration, root causes of migration. And this is a space where we can learn together, where we can discern together, and then get ready to vote. Because of course, that's what we need to do right now. There are so many other things that we will need to do after election, but this is something that we need to do today, right now. Remember that election has already started. November 3rd is only the end of election. So you can, of course, vote early. And we invite you to do that. I'm glad that, you know, the people, we have amazing guests today. But before starting, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. Pax Christi USA wishes to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the indigenous peoples, past and present, who have stewarded Turtle Island, a territory that includes what is currently known as the United States of America. We recognize and uplift the understanding that much of this land continues to be unceded and that many indigenous peoples' nations currently lack federal recognition. So with that said, I would like to introduce to you a longtime member of Pax Christi USA, Kathy O'Leary, who will help us put all of this conversation into perspective. She's the current coordinator for the New Jersey region for Pax Christi and has spent over a decade advocating for the release of people from immigration detention, and has also advocated for the closure of local ICE facilities. She was a board member for First Friends of New Jersey, New York, and currently works with the coalition Abolish ICE, New York, New Jersey. I must add that she's worked very hard to make this event possible. Kathy?
Hello, everyone. Now I should have tested sharing my screen because now I'm having a little trouble. Just bear with me for a second. Here we are. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here, and I will be very brief. I could go on and on, as many of you know, about immigration detention, particularly in New Jersey. That has been my focus for the last decade, more than a decade, but I won't do that tonight. What I'd like to do is introduce this topic in the context of Pax Christi USA. So there's 3 questions I'm going to answer, or hopefully give you a basis for. Why Pax Christi? Why now? And what does our faith tell us about migration and immigration? So the first, why should Pax Christi USA, an organization that's known for our work with regard to disarmament, demilitarization, why should we be talking about migration? And it's because of that historic focus on both disarmament, demilitarization, and reconciliation with justice that puts us in a very good position to have this conversation. For as long as I've been involved with Pax Christi, we've always not simply talked about the arms trade, but also the casualties of our foreign policy. The roots of migration and forced migration. The other thing that that makes us uniquely qualified and uniquely responsible, I would say, to have this conversation is that we are part of a global faith-based organization. And if the Gospels were being written today, or if we were to contemporize them, I don't think there's anyone, or very few people would argue that Americans would play the role of the Romans in the Gospels. So we need to, as a faith-based organization, do some serious reflection with regard to what it means to be at the center of this global empire. So why now? Not just because of the election, right? Although elections are always a good point to reflect on big policy issues. But I think we also need to look at the fact that no matter who occupies the White House on January 22nd of 2021, that the immigration system, migration system, our foreign policy or domestic policy has a long history rooted in white supremacy. And recently, with the revelations out of the Irwin County Detention Facility in Georgia, we were reminded of the long history of forced sterilizations against Black and brown women, primarily in our country, which is tied to our history of genocide as a country. However, it was the first time that I have heard the idea of genocidal acts in ICE reach the level of the mainstream media, if you call MSNBC mainstream. So this is an opportunity that I think we as Pax Christi should seize and start connecting the dots in all of these different areas. So in terms of being a faith-based organization and hopefully giving you some tools, for those of you who are new to this conversation, I highly recommend this particular document. I happened upon this when I first started organizing around immigration issues. And it's a very comprehensive document. But it is a way of looking at immigration and migration in the sense of what we are obligated to do and how we are obligated to view people who cross borders. So the traditional, we've all heard, I was a stranger in a strange land and you welcomed me, and Jesus is a migrant, and Mary being forced to give birth away from home. These are all very traditional ways of looking at migration. Tonight, I want to invite you to look at it a slightly different way. And I would like to look at you to look at it as opposed to the affirmative sense of what we are obligated to do, to look at it in the negative sense, in the absence of those things, right? It's not just our inactions that are important, but not just our actions that are important, but our inactions are just as important. So this is from the book of Sirach. The bread of charity is life itself for the needy. Whoever withholds it is a murderer. To take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deny a laborer wages is to shed blood. And that's a heavy passage, but I think it's appropriate for everything that we've been witnessing. And I think it's really important for us to be looking at this, like I said, in terms of not just what are we called to do, but what happens when we don't. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn this back over to Roxana.
Thank you so much, Kathy. This is a great introduction because we're going to hear now from folks from all over the world who are going to give us some background on this issue. And before that, though, I would like to share on the chat some resources that you can use. One of them is the Statement of Principles. It's something that Pax Christi put together ahead of the elections, and for people to consider, to hopefully help them in their discernment, to figure out who the ideal candidate, the ideal leaders are, so they can vote accordingly. And the second thing is our elections toolkit. It's a part of our campaign, Vote Pax. And there you will find some information about voting, and a few graphics that you can share and whatnot. So we invite you to look at that as well. Okay, so coming up is our first guest, is Dévora González from SOA Watch. Dévora is from Los Angeles, born to migrant parents that found refuge in the city after migrating from El Salvador and Guatemala. Aware of the anti-migrant sentiment, structural border conditions that fuel deaths at the desert, and feeling a strong connection to the communities forced to migrate to the United States, she relocated to Tucson, Arizona in 2012. She was co-coordinator of the Missing Crisis Hotline, a project of the Coalition de Derechos Humanos and No More Deaths, where they guided families through the process of locating missing relatives disappeared crossing the US-Mexico border. Dévora has been active in migrant rights work, resistance, and resilience of border communities in the face of militarization. She is now an organizer with SOA Watch, focusing on the program area of dismantling border imperialism. Dévora.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Pax Christi, for inviting me, for having me with you all. I am looking forward to really just to the other speakers and to making all of these connections at such a critical political moment. Just a correction, the hotline is called the Missing Migrant Crisis Hotline. And so what it is that we guide, and it's still very much active, and it's now a project of No More Deaths, and we guide families through the process of locating missing relatives. And so therefore we focused on 3 types of situations that would happen when a person was possibly in detention custody, when a person was in a search and rescue emergency situation, and when a situation where they could no longer be found. And so this was throughout the entire border region, connecting with different organizations, with different areas, and mobilizing as much as we can to look for people. And even just taking down and all the information that Border Patrol would give families, because the process of even looking for someone in custody is really complicated. And so all the information that we wrote down has really been helping, and has been compiled into the disappeared reports published by No More Deaths. So hopefully there's going to be one coming out really recently as well. So as part of SOA Watch, most of you know our work and have joined us at either the vigils at Fort Benning or at the encuentros en ambos Nogales. This year, unfortunately, is the first year where we're not going to have a physical, in-person mobilization, but we are going to be having some events online. So I just want to take the time to invite you all November 21st and 22nd. But continuing with that, our work has been to denounce the U.S. role in armed conflict in Latin America, making connections of the training that the military has received in conjunction to the violence and the massacres that the training actually creates in people's home countries, right? And as a result of this fueling migration, in the past few years, we stopped receiving the names of the WINSEC graduates, but we continue to focus on closing the SOA and closing WINSEC. Even without receiving the names, we've been able to find that in 2015, the first Border Patrol agent graduate was part of BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Union. And I will come back to why that also is really important. And we've been able to make the connection with ICE having a new urban warfare training facility at Fort Benning. In the past 2 weeks, our staff in conjunction with John Lindsay Poland, for example, and other longtime supporters, were able to put together a report called From the Beginning to the End, U.S. Armed Conflict, U.S. in the Colombian Armed Conflict. So, sorry, give me 1 second. This is the report. It's 66 pages. It's in Spanish right now, though we're working on translating it. But the highlights, the points of this document and of this report is highlighting how the United States has really helped fuel the Colombian armed conflict, right? And so willingly and knowingly, taking graduates that are fleeing Colombia because of their connection with massacres and still being trained at WINSEC, for example. So it's a lot of different things that are highlighted in this report. That is one of the ways that we continue to work with closing and holding the United States accountable and working around not directly having the names of WINSEC graduates, right? And so in the last few years, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mention again the different collaborations that they've had with ICE. And we know that historically, right? So you have the 1980s, you have all the armed conflict, you have the US training, the US funding, the support in coups, et cetera. And we know that that continues. We've seen it even most recently in Honduras with supporting the coup in 2009. But as that continues, what was happening at the same time is anti-migrant sentiment. It's different strategies implemented by Border Patrol that militarize the borderlands area, specifically prevention through deterrence. And so prevention through deterrence is a strategy. It's not policy. It wasn't voted on by Congress or anything. It was just a strategy that was implemented that militarized specific areas of the border throughout specific points, high points of traffic, creating different funnels in more rural areas where people now have to cross. And so in the actual prevention through deterrence document by the Border Patrol, you can see that they're talking about creating mortal dangers, militarizing natural landscapes to deter people from crossing. Now, we know years later that the deterrence actually means killing people and disappearing people. And so we know that years later, what's been happening is it's evolved to the current context that we now have under Donald Trump, right? And so it's not something that in the current situation of people in detention centers, of people disappearing while crossing, of all the deaths that are happening, it's not a bipartisan effort, or it's not something that happened in the past 4 years, but really that has been developing to the point that it's at now. This year alone has been one of the deadliest years in, at least in Southern Arizona, it has been one of the deadliest years of people crossing the desert. Temperatures were over 115, easily 120 degrees. And while this was happening, BORTAC has raided the No More Deaths camp 2 times this past summer. What that means, and BORTAC, the branch of Border Patrol, of course, has raided the camp 2 times. And so what that means is that there's even an intentional effort at stopping the humanitarian aid that has been offered. So the humanitarian aid camp ran by No More Deaths has been there for 16 years in a small town called Arivaca, Arizona. And they've been there for 16 years providing medical help to people that are crossing as they're crossing. And so this anti-migrant sentiment, really the intention to kill, has gotten to that point where now they've raided it 2 times. The first time they've detained over 30 people that were seeking refuge at the camp. And then this last time they detained another 12 people. And so the reason that I focus on BORTAC, the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, is because of their training at WINSEC. Of course, we need a lot more information, and we're working on doing more research of what specific, what now, right? 5 years later, since WINSEC has been trained at, since BORTAC Border Patrol has been trained at WINSEC, like what is their role now in training, or do they offer the training? Like what is the relationship? And we need to know more of that. But however, we can still make the connection that there is definite training going on. There is definitely a relationship. And so having known that in 2019, knowing that there's going to be a new urban warfare training facility for ICE located at Fort Benning, the place that has developed urban warfare training, now training ICE, really is a threat to our communities. On top of that, right, the relationship with Border Patrol and the increase in the deadly, like the way that things have become even more deadly, is definitely a thing to keep an eye on. And so I think I'm gonna finish with the last connection, is the abuse of power by Border Patrol and the continued abuse of power by Border Patrol. We saw in Minneapolis when there was the Black Lives Matter protest, Border Patrol responded and was flying a drone over Minneapolis in support of the police. We know that when there was a lot of raids, when there was a lot of actions and protests going on, Border Patrol also deployed some of the Border Patrol agents to different areas throughout the country to support the Black Lives Matter protests. And in Portland, Oregon specifically, they were grabbing, BORTAC was the one that was responding to and detaining people and putting them in unmarked vehicles, right? That was BORTAC. And so while Latin America knows this, grabbing someone and putting them in an unmarked vehicle is something that unfortunately is very commonplace, it's being brought back home now, right? All that training and everything that was developed and implemented in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in different places of the world, aside from just this hemisphere, is now being brought to the United States. And so definitely our need to respond to that, right? There's a lot of work to be done in the next few months and even beyond that, regardless of the outcome of the presidential elections. Like, we're still going to need to do a lot of work to not just like undo this, but to completely change the way that migration is viewed and acted upon in this country. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dévora. This was a great narrative about what is going on. A lot of people are not really familiar with what you just told us, especially when you link it to what is going on in the US. So it's not just outside of the US, but it's here. All right, so let me quickly, I think we're not doing so well with time, but we're gonna do our best. Switch to Azadeh Shahshahani. Azadeh is the Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South. Azadeh has worked for a number of years in the US South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslims, Middle Eastern and South Asian communities. She previously served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and as National Security Immigrants Rights Project Director with the ACLU of Georgia. Azadeh serves on the Advisory Council of the American Association of Jurists and on the Board of Directors of Defending Rights and Dissent. Azadeh has served as a trial monitor in Turkey and election monitor in Venezuela and Honduras, and as a member of the jury in people's tribunals in Mexico, the Philippines, and Brazil. She has also participated in international fact-finding delegations to post-revolutionary Tunisia and Egypt, as well as a delegation focused on the situation of Palestinian political prisoners, and more and more. Azadeh has done so many things, and we're just feeling so grateful that she's here with us today. Turn it to you, Azadeh.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you to Roxana and Kathy for the invitation. And I am very honored to be joining the panel along with comrades with the School of America's Watch and Bayan USA. So just a couple words about us. Project South, we're a social justice organization based in Atlanta. working in support of grassroots organizations and directly impacted communities in the US South as well as the global South. And I do want to continue talking about the roots of forced migration, namely US imperialism. It's really important for us to be having this conversation whenever we talk about immigrants' rights, because as we all know, nobody wakes up wanting to leave their countries and their homes, right? In various ways, they are forced to leave. And so the history of U.S. intervention in, Latin America, as Dévora was just talking about, is really important for us to remember. And definitely the 2009 coup in Honduras, very much U.S. supported. For us to keep in mind. So I was fortunate to be part of a delegation to Honduras around the elections after the coup, and we had the honor of meeting with Berta Cáceres, the indigenous environmental rights activist. And at that time, she let us know that she was on a death list that the paramilitaries affiliated with the government held, and of course she was murdered a few years ago by those same forces. And in the lead up to the elections, several people, human rights activists, labor rights activists were murdered, and there was a general atmosphere of intimidation and definitely fraud in the elections. And yet at the same time, we met with the US Embassy. They very much did not seem to care at all. This is during Obama, as a reminder. And after the sham elections, the US government called it a festival of democracy. And of course, you have continued U.S. support for the militarized, brutal regime in Honduras, which, is definitely a cause of destabilization and really creating an atmosphere of terror, forcing people to leave their countries, but also the Middle East. So I'm Iranian myself. I was actually born 4 days after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And many of us Iranians, I would say every Iranian remembers, even though we weren't born then, but we still do very much know and are aware of the U.S. role. So the U.S. and U.K. banded together their intelligence agencies and engineered a coup in 1953 to topple the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, because he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil, right? The concept that Iranians should have control over their natural resources was very strange to these imperialists. And so they got rid of Mossadegh and basically replaced him with the regime of the Shah, which meant that Iranians subsequently did not experience true democracy. And so, that by itself definitely led to, migration and forced immigration. And so, as an immigrant myself, the question lingers in my mind a lot of times, what if that coup had not happened? And what if democracy had been allowed to flourish in Iran? I think we would be in a very different place. And of course, we started this year, 2020, with a very real threat of U.S. war against Iran. Obviously, January 2nd was the assassination of the Iranian general. And then, very possible threat of U.S. bombing of Iran. So you can just imagine, as an Iranian American, how I and many Iranian Americans like me were feeling the first 20 days of the war. Thanks of the year. Thanks to the support of many organizations coming together and really expressing their outrage and lack of tolerance for another U.S. war. That war did not happen, but I did want to remind you all that sanctions are very much in place. And as we know, sanctions are not an alternative to war. Sanctions are war, right? They are a form of war, especially in the midst of the pandemic, where they are depriving Iranians of access to basic medical equipment. And so, Biden is elected or, whatever happens, we need to keep the pressure up, because it's not enough not to be engaged in actual warfare with, like bombing. We have to stop the sanctions. They are starving the Iranian people, and they're leading to deaths, again, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And, along the same lines, in various parts of the Middle East, as folks know, the US has been involved with various wars and invasions and aggression. So from, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and also lending very direct support to the Saudi regime in terms of their genocidal campaign against the Yemeni people, which has in turn led to people having to flee their homes in order to save their lives, and leading to this massive refugee crisis. And so then, the connection then between US foreign policy, imperialism, and forced migration. And then once people get here, folks who are able to make it. So instead of providing them a refuge, the US government puts them in horrid detention centers, such as the Irvine County Detention Center. And so we have documented conditions at Irvine for many years. And we know that the treatment of immigrants at this prison has always been horrible. So in 2017, we put out a report called In Prison Justice Inside 2 Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, which found evidence of sexual abuse, inadequate medical care, lack of prenatal care for pregnant women, lack of clean drinking water, and rampant use of solitary confinement. Just in the spring, a group of women came together at Irvine. They produced a video to try to get their voices out about their fear of catching COVID and the fact that the facility wasn't doing anything to protect them. And instead of addressing their concerns, the facility, which is run by a private prison corporation, subjected them to solitary confinement, leading to grave emotional and mental health damage for all of them. And I'm sure folks have heard about the complaint that we put forward to the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, documenting a range of issues, including the fact that they were actively refusing to test people. And, they only started to test people when Project South filed a complaint a couple of months ago. And medical staff shredding medical requests from detained immigrants, the management mandating employees to work even if they're symptomatic and waiting for test results. And also an issue that has received considerable attention for good reason, concerns voiced by detained immigrants and Ms. Guten, our client, the courageous nurse who came forward, who's a whistleblower, about the numbers of procedures on detained women's bodies and issues surrounding informed consent. So these shocking revelations further highlight the extent of the egregious abuse at the facility and the fact that Black and brown immigrant women are held in an extremely vulnerable position at this prison, where they have no control over their bodies and no say about what is done to them, is sickening. So in terms of the next steps, we sent a letter to Congress, and they already passed a resolution condemning, the House already passed a resolution condemning the procedures overwhelmingly. And a congressional delegation came down here a couple weeks ago. They visited Irvine. After they got out, they called it a horror show, and they called for it to be shut down. So what we're pushing for is a hearing is really what we need, and for them to be to continue to call for this facility to be shut down. Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General has opened an investigation, though it's not really proceeding at the speed which it should. We have filed the Freedom of Information Act request along with another organization seeking to obtain information and records about procedures at the various facilities, ICE facilities across the country, because, we found out about what was happening at Irvine. Who knows what is happening in other facilities and what type of violence women may be experiencing. And it's really important for us to remember that, in the context of Irvine, the scrutiny must not stop with examining the actions of one individual, the doctor, right? This is about ICE and the private prison corporation La Salle. And the US government, as well as the private prison corporation running this prison, should be held accountable. So we are determined to push ahead by pursuing a thorough congressional investigation, the HSOIG investigation, and we will also go to the UN and the Inter-American Commission, as we have before for the past few years. That's what we have done to expose the human rights violations by the US government. It is time for Irving to be shut down before we see even more immigrants subjected to egregious abuse. And I would like to leave you with a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer: "Nobody is free until everybody's free." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azadeh, for that narration. This is why we bring all the different voices to the people who are able to attend these forums, because you hear voices from people who are directly and somewhat indirectly affected by these laws and by oppression in general. And you are able to make the connections that these foreign policies are not just things that happen, you know, here or there, but they're like systemic, right? They're happening in multiple places. And so with that, I will quickly invite Nina Macapinlac. She is the Deputy Secretary General of Bayan USA, an overseas chapter of Bayan Philippines, and an alliance of over 30 anti-imperialist Filipino organizations in the United States, representing sectors of youth and students, women, professionals, and migrant workers. Nina is also a longtime community activist based in the New York, New Jersey area. Nina?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on your panel today. I'm really honored to be here with all of you and really inspired by all of the work that's already been discussed. I'm going to present a slide deck. I really hope it can fit in the time allotted. Let me see if I can do this right. Okay. Do you see this? Yes. Okay. Is it full screen now? Is it all right now? Full screen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So again, my name is Nina. Today, I'm really hoping to go over several things in my presentation. I was asked to speak more broadly about the roots of migration and how we understand forced migration, especially through the case study of the Philippine diaspora. So I'll talk about the overall situation of the Philippines and the diaspora, including our analysis of forced migration and impacts of neoliberalism and militarism. Also, we'll share about Bayan's international and local campaigns and the relationship between a broader global strategy and mass organizing on the ground, and also our perspective on solidarity and building power in the context of the current US elections. What are the conditions of the Philippines? The Philippines consists of 107 million people, and more than 1 million Filipinos every year leave to work abroad. So we are one of the largest diasporas in the world. There's about 12 million Filipinos living overseas in over 239 countries and territories. The Philippines is the second highest receiver of remittances. And geopolitically, the Philippines is really a strategic ally of the United States. It was a colony of the US before US bought it from Spain. And what we say now is that it is still a semi-colony of the US, totally subservient to the US militarily, economically, and politically. So this is just a infographic, if you may, of the class breakdown in the Philippines. The social stratification in the Philippines is greatly impacted by the neoliberal policies pushed by the US and the global system of imperialism. And so, I really urge everyone to think of this as just, like I said before, a case study of forced migration, because this situation of a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society really is not isolated to the Philippines. We see it often throughout the global South, and of course, different countries have their own conditions, but it's often, there are similar trends. And here we see how wealth and power is concentrated at the hands of the 1%, in which we, in buy and call the comprador bourgeoisie. So these are the people who own the land and dominate politics. For example, there's only 40 families in total that control over 75% of the economy, while 90% of the population, which are workers and peasants, are the ones who have the least wealth and power. And the Philippines, being a semi-colony, really doesn't have its own industries, and its biggest export, as we say, is really its own people, because there are no jobs at home, because there's no genuine agrarian reform. Filipinos are really pushed out of their country, and only 69 million people in the Philippines survive on less than $2 a day, with 46 million Filipinos going hungry every day. This slide just goes over, who are the Filipino migrants. In the Philippines, there's actually a government agency that was started during the dictator Ferdinand Marcos's administration, or regime, more accurately. That is assigned to monitor and supervise the recruitment and the overseas recruitment and manning of the agencies in the Philippines. Basically promoting and facilitating the export of our people overseas. They monitor the markets in different countries. And so instead of making sustainable livelihood at home through industrialization and job creation, the Philippine economy really stays afloat by exporting our people as cheap labor. And so here you can see is also the POEA is that agency, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. And as you can see, 78.3% are land-based, meaning those are sea-based contract workers, undocumented migrants, immigrants, including J1 workers. And so J1 workers, even though they're categorized as interns, are essentially immigrant workers and are often very vulnerable to trafficking. And then land-based workers are a mixture of nurses, engineers, teachers, accountants, domestic helpers, hospitality workers, and others. And so in the US, there are 4 million Filipinos in the US, and 1 in 6 are undocumented. And I say all of this to demonstrate just the scope of the diaspora. And I guess one example to really illustrate the lopsidedness of a country that exports its own people as cheap labor, as well as a country that doesn't ensure sustained livelihood, also resulting in a brain drain of professionals, is that the Philippines provides 25% of overseas nurses, but only has a ratio of 1 to 50,000 nurses in public hospitals, which is where the most poor are serviced. So just to paint really the situation of the Filipino diaspora. And what are the manifestations of the root problems of the Philippines when it comes to forced migration? There are several things that have already been touched on. Really, landlessness, joblessness, militarism, privatization, and labor export policy are some of the driving things pushing our people from the Philippines to go seek lives elsewhere. So landlessness, like I said before, like the 1% really controls most of the land and the political life in the Philippines. So these big landlords, along with US corporations, acquire huge tracts of land for agribusiness and commercial use, which then displace peasants and indigenous peoples from our lands, causing internal displacement as well as out-migration from the country. And then joblessness, since the Philippines is really import dependent and export oriented, there really is not many jobs for people there. And so workers and professionals migrate out. And then along with this comes contractualization. So there's a lot of job insecurity in the Philippines. People are forced to take jobs for meager pay on 6-month contracts with no access to benefits. and then also privatization. So due to the multilateral economic agreements that the Philippine government has with the US and other quote unquote developed nations, the cost of social services and basic commodities are placed in the hands of private institutions. And so currently, the price of healthcare, education, food, water, electricity, transportation, gas are consistently increasing while the wages remain the same. Currently, a family of 6, they only make about $27 a month. So yes, the situation in the Philippines is, the disparity is so wide. And then finally, labor export policy. This is the legislation that aims to regulate and broker the export of Filipino workers as commodities to the overseas labor market. Even the education system is really geared towards, the export of people. The last 2 years of high school are geared towards training people in vocational occupations, so people know how to sew, cook, do things like that, so that they can be semi-skilled cheap labor in the global market. And currently under the Duterte regime, so Rodrigo Duterte is the dictator in the presidential palace in the Philippines. There's been over 30,000 killings under his regime. The war on drugs, which is really a war on the poor, and also attacks on human rights defenders and dissidents are the people who are victims of the 30,000 killing number. And the Philippines is really under martial rule. Most of the president's cabinet is former military officials. And we can see this militarism in the COVID-19 response. The country, Philippines is the country with the most quarantine-related apprehensions in Asia. And while, people are struggling to provide food on the table, the Philippines even closed a multi-billion-dollar deal with the US for a number of weapons, 6 attack helicopters, 6 Hellfire missiles, 26 advanced precision kill weapon systems, machine guns, rocket launchers, et cetera, all in the midst of a global pandemic. And so this militarist response to a medical crisis really demonstrates just how much the Philippines is under martial rule and under fascism. So the recent passage of the anti-terror law in July is a continued intensification of state repression and fascism, especially against people who speak out against Duterte. This law defines terrorism very broadly and legalizes the repression of dissent, allowing the government to arrest people even on mere suspicion. And in the first month of the implementation, we already saw, the intimidation and mass arrests of activists and the brutal killings of different mass leaders and peace advocates, including all of the folks here. Some of them are people that we know work personally with in the US. Even among us in the United States, different leaders in the movement are being intimidated and harassed online, myself included. And so we see this really as an intensification of the state repression under the Duterte regime. Meanwhile, the US continues to provide $550 million worth of military aid to Duterte and enable these human rights abuses. Let's see here. So we understand all of this as a part of a global economic system of imperialism. We see the existence of the diaspora as well as the conditions of our home country as something that does not exist in a vacuum. It's really part of the world system in which a few monopoly corporations really dominate the economy. A small ruling class benefits from the profits extracted through exploitation of the working and poor majority of people throughout the world. And in this current system of imperialism, we also see war constant war being utilized to divide the world up among the most powerful countries, and causing this, coerced migration of people from the global South to the quote unquote more developed countries. And so, these movements, this coerced movement of people is really a result of imperialism through neoliberal policies, war, conflict, violence, sanctions, which Azadeh mentioned before, climate crisis, and the destruction of land and resources. So we really see, the importance of building with other migrant communities, other, oppressed nationalities throughout the global South, because our struggles are really interconnected in the struggle against imperialism. And now I'm going to go through, trying to go quickly, sorry, it's taking a little bit, through some of the campaigns of Bayan. Bayan, we have this global analysis, but we also see the importance of really going to the local communities and organizing from the grassroots. So our campaigns are always in this context, the importance of community organizing and building solidarity for the long haul, because we know that no matter who is in office, even if it's not Duterte, even if it's not Trump, these problems have really deep roots that didn't just come up in the last decade. We know that the root causes of the problems in Philippine society will not be addressed with the mere switching out of the figurehead of imperialism. So it's really important to us to organize, to build our collective power, to continue educating, organizing, and mobilizing our communities wherever Filipinos exist. And the existence of this Filipino diaspora presents to us also an opportunity to reach farther to build power farther outside of the Philippines. So we see the organizing of migrants outside of the Philippines as part and parcel to the liberation of the whole country, even if they are, scattered all over the world, even if they're on the other side of the world in the United States. So both the local and the global strategy is very important to us in Bayan. I'm gonna just go quickly through some of the campaigns. So some of the migrant worker campaigns that we've done. So during COVID, there were a number of Filipino workers on J1 visas who were stranded during COVID-19. The J1 visa exchange visitor program was created over 50 years ago in Congress. And it, every year there's about 300,000 workers that enter the US. But are often, this program often sees a lot of exploitation, even trafficking. And so there was a campaign to support the J1 workers during COVID, and they organized themselves into this J1 network. There's also campaigns to support Jollibee workers in their struggle for hazard pay, workplace safety, struggle against contractualization, and also struggle for paid leave in the midst of COVID-19. The Grand Princess Seafarer campaign is a campaign trying to get the 600 plus seafarers that stranded on the Grand Princess cruise ship that was stricken with COVID-19 to disembark and get tested. So these are just examples of some of the more local campaigns. And so these are all throughout the US. The Grand Princess Seafarers is mostly in San Francisco. Jollibee mostly in the East Coast. J1 is throughout the country. These are more migrant worker campaigns that we've taken on. We worked with Kathy for a really long time, actually. So in the Northeast, we have a long-time visitation program supporting Filipino migrants, as well as migrants, detained migrants of other nationalities in the different detention centers throughout New Jersey. And currently, we also have this campaign international campaign, really specific to the U.S. To combat Duterte. We're really trying to push in Congress something that was actually inspired by the Berta Cáceres Act, inspired and modeled after the Berta Cáceres Act, to cut U.S. military aid to Duterte. So Bayan is part of a coalition called the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, which is a broad network of over 40 orgs throughout the country concerned with the human rights situation in our home country. So this includes faith groups, academics, NGOs, environmental groups, human rights organizations. And so through this ICHIRP network, as well as other, concerned organizations and individuals, we are able to get Pennsylvania Representative Susan Wild to introduce the Philippine Human Rights Act last September. There were initially 19 congressional reps. There's more now. I have to check on the number. But the idea is to suspend security assistance to the Philippines until they're held accountable. So as you can see here, these are the conditions that they must follow to lift the restrictions set by the bill. So the investigation and prosecution of members of the military and police who have violated human rights, withdrawing the military from domestic policy, establishing protections for these different sectors, and critics of the government taking steps to guarantee a judicial system that is capable of investigating, prosecuting, and bringing to justice members of the police and military who committed human rights abuses, and fully complying with any and all audits or investigations regarding the improper use of security aid. I urge folks who are watching to, support this campaign. You can learn more in humanrightsph.org. If your organization wants to endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act, you can at this link, tinyurl.com/endorse the PHRA, or sign the petition that will go directly to your representative. Organizations can also join this coalition, the International Coalition for Human Rights. You can read more about it at this link, and also fill out the application to join if you want to support as a member organization. But yes, that is all. Tuloy ang laban means the struggle continues. And I'm so happy to be here learning more about other people's struggles, because, I'm not just here for the struggle of my people, but also the struggle of all oppressed and exploited around the world, because our struggles are one. And just really grateful for this conversation and the launch of the working groups of Pax Christi.
Thank you, Nina. That was so amazing. And that presentation was so thorough. And even though we are running out of time, I think that it was well worth it, because we learned so much. I want to say that if people don't mind, if we can stay for another 10 minutes perhaps, so we can chat a little bit, maybe get the chance to ask you some questions. I know some of the folks may have to run, but check back on Facebook, and we'll have the recording there, so you can hear some of the answers. I really appreciate it that you mentioned that our struggles are interconnected. That we are in this together, that we don't fight for only our people, and I quote that, but we are all our people, right? And we have to unite so we can learn from each other, because that amazing example that you mentioned of the following the lead of people in Honduras, or perhaps also the Hondurans in the US, trying to stop the flow of money from the US to that narco state of Juan Orlando Hernandez. And I would love to maybe, Dévora, if you have anything to say about that. I know that SOA Watch has also been looking into passing that act, the Berta Cáceres Act.
Actually, this area of work has been led a lot by our colleague, Brigetta. She is currently based in Honduras. in Guatemala. And so I don't have a lot of updates about that specifically, but I do know that she's been working on a report around, a report around one of the intellectual authors of Berta Cáceres' murder, right? And so there's been a lot of connections with SOA, WINSEC, and so I think that this report, and I will find it, but he's one of the people that's been really related to DESA, the corporation that is behind her murder. And so I think that there's a lot still going on in terms of defunding and needing to make sure that there isn't a lot of training and a lot of support toward the Juan Orlando Hernandez regime, but like we still have some ways to go. We keep going though, we keep working.
Thank you. And yes, there's so much more work to do. I want to briefly mention before people start disconnecting that Pax Christi USA is starting a working group where people will be able to collaborate, because Kathy has been such an amazing person on the ground, collaborating with all these different organizations and doing all this amazing work. And we want many Kathys around the country. We want people everywhere supporting grassroots efforts, supporting people directly affected, following the lead of those impacted. And so I'm also really happy that we have Azadeh here, because one of the things that you mentioned was sanctions are war. That was a really powerful statement. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about what the US has done in regards to the banks in Iran?
Yeah, and I actually maybe I'll share the link to a presentation I did on this a couple of weeks ago. That's pretty detailed and goes into, in the interest of time, because I know folks have to leave. But I'll drop that in the chat in terms of just making it very difficult for banks and just on all sectors of the Iranian economy, which all of this obviously is the people who suffer, right? It's the Iranian people. It's just in terms of making it more difficult to them to access medicine, medical equipment, and basically necessities of life. So I'm gonna go ahead and find that link and drop it in the chat in a second.
Thank you, Azadeh. And we did have a question on the chat, and anybody's welcome to answer. It says the news story yesterday about 545 children still not reunited. What can we do to help? And anybody is welcome to answer that.
I just want to start off the conversation really quickly by saying that we need to call it what it is. It's genocide. That the families, the children who are not sent to live with another member of their family, but were sent to another group or still in foster care. That's technically and very explicitly an act of genocide, and it's something that we need to start calling it by its name. And I'll just let anybody else want it.
Yeah, and it really brings to mind what happened in this entire territory of what is called now the Americas, right? When indigenous children were separated from their family members. Dévora, did you have a comment?
I mean, I feel like it's going back toward just like answering that question of what can we do? And I think that a lot of it, like at the moment, is continuing to like have some like work toward having some kind of change, right? And I think like most urgently, what can we do right now is try to get this current administration out of power and continue to hold them accountable. I mean, if like individuals have connections about looking for people in Central America, et cetera, I mean, I feel like that's great. We should continue to try to like reunite families. But when we don't have those specific connections, I think like exposing and continuing to talk about it, especially in our communities, is, and like in the spaces in which we inhabit, is one of the most important things that we can do. Like whatever's within our reach, and I feel like that, like talking about it is really important, and exposing that is vital.
Yes, and this process that has been so long, right? It's starting with the imprisoning entire families, and so we can see that this is not only about one president, but many other presidents, right? So how do we continue the work, even though, of course, we have to elect a person right now, but whoever that person is, and regardless of who that person is, we continue organizing, and we continue looking, of course, to make sure that people are safe, and not only safe, but have a life with dignity, but also looking into the root causes of migration, right? Because Azadeh mentioned this also, that people don't just wake up one morning and want to migrate. And so if people can at some point not have to leave their communities, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? And we are at 7:07. So unless any of our guests has anything to add, I'm going to start wrapping this up. Any comments? Any final comments? Any calls to action?
Actually, I do have a couple things. One is that I had shared some articles in relation to, U.S. Foreign policy and the connections to forced migration with Roxana and Kathy. So hopefully the folks who attended the webinar will be getting copies of those. And, one of them is actually written from a personal perspective in terms of something I didn't talk about during the presentation is that I grew up in Iran during the Iran-Iraq War, and the traumatic experience that was. And so I hope that folks will have a chance to read that. I don't think that you really can know what war is about until you have been victimized by it in some form or another, or who have had ancestors who have been victimized by it in one form or another. Yeah. And then the second thing I wanted to share is that on December 10th, Human Rights Day, Project South is actually coordinating a webinar on holding the U.S. government accountable through the human rights framework, through the, Inter-American Commission or the various UN procedures or otherwise. And we have really excellent speakers lined up, including Indigenous and Puerto Rican comrades. So please do join us. And this is part of a quarterly webinar focused on featuring voices from comrades from the Global South. And that's really important for us to make connections, to learn from the experience of folks, to share tactics of resistance, and to learn more about the role of the US government in creating disaster around the world. And as US-based people, it is on us, right, to hold the US government accountable and try to basically force a change in foreign policy. So again, I really appreciate this opportunity to be with you all and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Azadeh. And that's the reason why we are intentional about bringing the voices and uplifting the voices of people directly impacted, because we won't hear this from other so-called experts on our lives, right? We are the only ones who can tell our stories because we've lived through them, or our families have lived through them. And so I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank the people who have attended this panel. And please let us know if you would like to be part of the working group. We would love for you to be part of it. Kathy is definitely energized and ready to do it. And of course, the first piece of it was this panel, putting together this panel to really lay the ground, to really let people know what's going on, what our communities are going through, and start working on it. Let's start doing more work on the ground. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time.